Welcome to folks joining via the recording. I know it's late for a New Year's thing, but I continue to have a New Year's resolution to upload these in a more timely fashion, which I will attempt to do. So we have two modeling issues that it would be good to talk through today. One, and then further API discussion. So the first one is a new one from Thomas about the language of the label property. So it is issue 319 in the GitHub. Put the link in, and I will share my screen so people can see the issue. So the question was, how do we deal with the language of the label, e.g. that the name for the English language and label is English, but how do we know that that's the English name and not Anglais for in French or Inglés for, I guess, Spanish? And of course, the same applies to any label. Ethan replied saying, I assume there isn't a rule against having more than one label. But I think the question here is about the purpose of the label property. So the purpose of label is to have a very easy way to add in documentation to the data intended for people looking at the data and not for people who are looking at some rendered version of it. So if you are a software developer or a data scientist or an information scientist or similar, then having just the URI vocab.edu/AAT 300388277 type language, that doesn't tell you much. You have to go and look at what 388277 is to figure out that it is in fact English. However, with the label of English, you don't need to do that. So for a very small cost to the publishers, there is a great savings in terms of time and ease of understanding for people looking at the data. So the question then, of course, is what if the person looking at the data doesn't speak the language of the label? Then indeed there is a mismatch, and the label doesn't help. In that scenario, then you would still have to go and dereference the URI to figure out what language it is. And in this case, that would probably be fine because the Getty vocabularies are reasonably well internationalized, and there are preferred labels, preferred terms for different languages for almost all of the concepts. So I think the question is not how do we say what language the string English is in, but really, because that would imply that there was some machine purpose for that, but whether we want to have multiple labels available, or whether anyone would use that functionality. My thought is that this is overkill, and that most systems are not internally internationalized to this degree, and that most labels will be, to a large extent, automatically generated either from data, which won't have the internationalization, or by constructing it from structured data, and then having multiple labels also doesn't really help. So, or would help, but is unlikely to ever be put into practice. So my thought would be that we should, in fact, have a rule against having more than one label, and it's really the choice of the publisher as to which label, which language they want to use for that label, based on their audience for the data. It'd be lovely if everyone could put in multiple labels, but I think the cost of doing that would be unbearably high for most of our organizations. But yeah, thoughts from everyone?
I agree with that. I am, I think, still a little bit concerned just about the confusion of the special meaning of the underscore label as opposed to being a data element. And I'm wondering, I mean, it works. If I was just kind of thinking through this, but if you had like an anchor tag after the AAT, is that a no-no in the linked open data world? Would that invalidate the URI?
Yeah, having a fragment on the end of the URI would make it a different resource.
Okay, all right, yeah.
It wouldn't be English anymore.
Yeah, so that's not an option. Okay.
No. But yes, otherwise that would be a good pattern to adopt, and then you could simply put whatever you wanted into at the end of the URI. Yeah, we've gone not back and forth on label, but certainly we used to call it just label, and then we added the underscore to try to make it a bit more visible that it was not data, it was internal documentation. But yes, it stands out, I would say, to us because of exactly that it's the only point where we have internal documentation in the model or API. So it's a little bit jarring in that respect. Sammy, I know you've done quite a lot of work with your data set. As a sanity check, would you be able to generate multiple labels for a resource, equally, if there was the capability to have multiple labels for a resource, would that be useful?
I've been thinking about it as we've been talking, and I don't think we have a use case for needing multiple labels, and so I don't really want to impact the decision being made in case somebody does have a solid use case that I just don't happen to
have. Does anyone have either the capacity or desire for multiple labels? And we can defer a final decision, but it would certainly be good to have a steer and say, if you have this, then please speak up over the next 2 weeks. Otherwise, we're going to close it.
Yeah, I mean, there's not really even a language. I mean, like you had said before, it could be any language. This is really just it's a shortcut to having to dereference the URI.
Yep.
And so it's whatever the primary, what could be assumed to be the primary label for that element is. Yeah.
All right. So I propose that I will write up the discussion into the issue, say that the participants on the call didn't have any requirement for it, and that if there is concrete requirements, then having to organizations with that requirement would be a way to move it forwards. But otherwise that we'd propose to close it in favor of just the status quo of having exactly one label without, so sorry, 0 or 1 labels without a language associated. Then the next issue is a bigger one, and it's a shame that Thanasis or George aren't here, because I would anticipate that they will have opinions about it. So the next one is issue 246, which I'll throw into the chat, but it's in the agenda as well, of how to describe named but unidentified actors, so groups or people. And there's 2 possible ways to do this. So the use case, sorry, is we know that someone called Jan van der Velde bought hundreds of objects. And indeed, there are in the provenance index some 6,000 references to Jan van der Velde. But we know from some research that there were at least 3 Jan van der Veldes, all in the same family, all of whom collected. So we know that it was this, the buyer had this particular name. It is likely that it was one of those 3 individuals, but we have no way of knowing which. And it could have been someone else completely. So the way that we had been approaching this was to create essentially an unidentified Jan van der Velde for every single transaction that we couldn't associate with an identifiable person. This meant that we had 6,000 Jan van der Veldes in our data set, and then when you do a search for van der Velde, you end up with a result set of 6,003 people. A few have many, participate in many different activities, and the rest of them only do one thing. So it was not helpful to either the machine or to any human. At which point we thought, well, this is silly. We shouldn't be doing this if this is not helping anyone, even if it is strictly true. So internally we thought, well, we could use instead a group to represent the set of people which could be the actual actor, which is a little bit strange from the ontology perspective, because that group could actually be just one person. It's not really 6,000 unique individuals. And they can't really take any sort of coherent action, in that it's just people with the same name that we can't otherwise distinguish. Or if it was just anonymous 17th century Italian people aren't a coherent group that can take action like an organization or an institution. But this, but yeah, the alternatives all seem worse. So the thought is, if we could have a group that is classified as some classification to say it's an anonymous group or a group of unidentified but describable people, it would reduce the number of entities that we need to manage in our information systems. It would then collect all of the people together, so you would end up with known, van der Velde Senior, van der Velde Junior, van der Velde Junior, and named but unidentified van der Velde. So only 4 that the person would then need to look through to see what their data or what their information need was going to refer to. So, any thoughts on this one? How have people dealt with this in information systems locally?
Well, I know what can be problematic, which is if you search for, anonymous 16th century Italian, and then you get back a list of works by that anonymous actor. It's is that useful or not? I would say probably not.
Yep. Yeah, there's two. So the use cases that we have considered for it were, we want to know all of the works made in Italy in the 16th century. At which point, if it's a group with those properties, then you can filter easily the objects that without needing to worry too much about the person. The flip side is, if you want to, if the focus is on the person or the workshop or whatever, then who was the most prolific artist? Well, it was Mr. Anonymous or Ms. Anonymous, and that's just worthless, right? So you would need to be able to filter out the anonymous, the unidentified actors easily in any sort of macro level corpus question. Otherwise, that would dramatically skew any statistics in favor of anonymous people being prolific artists. So, yeah, I agree that searching for anonymous people directly doesn't make a lot of sense, but searching for their properties might make sense, and hence having a way to manage them without tons and tons of overhead, I think, is valuable. Any other considerations? Maybe we just don't have the people on the call, the right people on the call, to dive into the details of this one.
I do want to say that this actually came up for me just yesterday.
Oh.
I'm having someone go through and standardize the name creator headings in our archives metadata, not our library catalog. And this is material that I haven't examined closely before. But we received a number of materials from the Robert Motherwell Foundation, which is a distinct ongoing entity of the artist Robert Motherwell. But the person who wrote this one particular finding aid definitely decided that the materials came from the studio of Robert Motherwell, that they were in some way a creator of the work, studio of Robert Motherwell. Robert Motherwell was also a creator of some of that work, so there are multiple creators for it. But I don't know that I had seen such a modern example of this before.
Yep. Yeah, that's interesting.
We've also come across this recently in trying to deal with our use cases for the Art Information Commons, and one of them is trying to surface more African American artist histories and representations within our collection, and the fact that there's a lot of unknown artists associated with the collections that we have and the information we have, and that we can only kind of figure out who they are contextually based on community or collaborative or collective, these sorts of things. So defining properties around such groups would probably be helpful in trying to surface this information.
And then in information management systems, my experience is that there is a single constituent or entity that represents all anonymous people, as opposed
That's the
to,
case.
Yeah.
That's the case for PMA.
It's another case here. Sammy, I imagine it's the same in EMU?
Yes, yeah, it is.
Yeah. In terms of path of least resistance, having a some entity that represents anonymous people would be a much easier route than forcing that to be turned into many individuals, each of which is just an anonymous person.
I have a quick question, and I might have missed it, but would this be many multiple groups? So we could say like an unidentified French person, an unidentified German person, because that's information we do have and would like to represent somehow.
Yeah, every I think it would be a case of having a group for each set of properties. So the anonymous person, where you know nothing about them, is a different group from anonymous French person, is not different from anonymous French 17th century person, is anonymous from 17th century French woman, is, you know, etc., etc. If there is any distinguishing information, then it gets turned into a separate group rather than into many separate individuals.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then when you do find out who it is, you simply remove it and point it to the real person as opposed to the anonymous group.
Yes, hopefully at some point.
Yes, indeed. Cross fingers.
And I agree with Sammy. I mean, we do have smaller unidentified groups, you know, either by century or culture or places of activity. So, you know, 18th century French or 15th century British, yeah, that we have those group records in our collections management systems.
Yep. Okay, so perhaps we move ahead tentatively with this, and then if the ontologists have a complaint, we can discuss any concerns down the line.
And there wouldn't be any confusion as to that the actual creator was one of those people in the group, as opposed to the group meaning everyone in the group contributed to it.
Yeah, the semantics around that in the ontology are thankfully pretty clear, that it's attributed to the group, the set of people, but not everyone in the set had necessarily had any role or even knowledge of it. So if OCLC publishes a document, it's not that all however many thousand people who work for OCLC even knew about that document, but that the attribution is to OCLC and not to the individuals who may not be known. Well, I guess for a document they would be, but or equally a painting that comes from the workshop of Rembrandt. Clearly, not every single member of the workshop necessarily took part. It could have just been a single person. So that one, thankfully, is fine. The concern will be about the use of group, when what we really want is something like a set of people, because the set of all 17th century people in France, you know, they couldn't, that's not a coherent organization. They couldn't do something. It's just a set of people. You couldn't, I guess with absolute knowledge, you could enumerate all of them, but for most practical purposes, you couldn't, or indeed for any practical purpose. So yeah, it's the details of the scope notes about group and the lack of a mathematical set notion in the ontology. That's the sticking point.
Yeah, and I think somewhat related to that, we've done some work in the past on reconciliation using contextual information that's in the graph, and instinctively, therefore, I quite like the idea of having the group associated with positively identified traits that kind of define that anonymous group. But at the same time, it would be useful to be able to distinguish a group that exists for purpose of being anonymous, which of course isn't really a group in the sense of contextual similarity, or it doesn't have the same ramifications as one that is a defined and declared group for purposes of a type of similarity. I think we'd be able to do that here, but that's something to watch out for too.
Yep. Okay. So we have 10 minutes left. I think it would be good to move on to the API discussion. 2 weeks ago in Philadelphia, we had a good, solid morning of discussion about URIs and media types and so on. And the notes are pretty thorough, so we don't need to go through them in any great detail. But one of the decisions that we sort of reiterated from Oxford was to not focus on the sort of creation aspect, but instead first on how to retrieve the data. If you can't retrieve the data, then you can't build anything, regardless of whether there's a creation, update, and delete mechanism. Create, update, and delete also requires authorization and authentication, which is a rabbit hole of fun and games that we want to avoid at this stage. So one previous thought, however, was to use a W3C standard called LDP, the Linked Data Protocol, which I realize I did not put a link into the agenda. I can quickly grab it for you. So LDP is 5 years old, and now it is not very well implemented compared to some other standards. And it focuses mostly on the create, update, and delete parts of things. It's also very focused on triples and how to split up big documents where there's many assertions. And we don't really have that particular challenge. I think one thing that we might want to consider about LDP is the notion of containers and whether that is a useful notion to keep in mind when we're thinking about the URIs that we might generate. So in the note doc, I'll just put in a URI. So imagine that there was a URI data.get.edu museum art paintings 877. So that could be, it's not, but it could be the URI for a particular painting 877, whatever painting that might be. So what LDP would say, so this is the instance, LDP would then say that the URI up until the end is a container in which you can create and manage objects. And indeed, the same for any other subpath that you want to treat that way. So museum/art would also be a container in which a container of containers. A museum could be a container of containers. And then there are particular patterns of interaction to say this is how you get the list of all of the things in the container. This is how you can create things within the container, and so forth. So it's very nicely RESTful. It does create clever, interpretable, understandable URIs. There is, however, the consideration that for paintings is very tied to the data being managed. In CRM, in the ontology, we would have objects at this layer, I guess. So I think that rather than necessarily advocating for people adopting LDP, we should simply keep in mind the best practices that LDP would have us implement, and think about them in terms of our interactions. But as always, what do people think? I know in the URI discussion, we said that we should we should make have as few requirements as possible so that people can do whatever implementation they want, and then simply follow their nose to find resources. But if this was a best practice level thing, if you want to think about it this way, then ... would that be something that would both tie it into existing standards and specifications, and give some guidance for people who don't already have implementations that they need to deal with? Dave, I guess looking to you first for a
right. Yeah, no, I mean, this is the container aspect is really compelling and useful, and it looked like LDP also had some very basic level of querying, at least in terms of including and excluding certain elements from the response. I don't know that it didn't seem to have, aside from that level of filtering, it didn't necessarily have like, give me only the elements where this property is equal to a value or something like that, which I still think is missing in general. I mean, I'm not, as I think you probably all know, I'm not convinced that, that Sparkle is the one and only answer for this, but I think it's kind of early.
An opinion which I share.
Yeah. So I think we need to. I think it would be to the benefit of us as a community to arrive at a solution for that. So if I say, I want to find all of the Philadelphia Museum of Art's objects that are on view, I have a way of, once I know what their Linked Art API implementation endpoint is, I know how to retrieve that data.
Yep.
And I think there are similar use cases like that. I mean, we don't have to allow for anything or for everything, but I think we have to at least meet some kind of minimum bar on that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But as far as this, I'm wondering whether, so when we talked about URIs, those are identifiers basically for the objects. And in the case of your paintings 877, what I'm wondering is there room for both of those concepts in LDP or in an LDP implementation, so that if 877 was your, it's not a URI, but if it was id.getty.edu object/877, would there be some way of injecting a representation of that URI in place of the 877 here, so that we can all adopt the same URI pattern, but still have the flexibility of defining our URIs for individual entities however we want? Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, the LDP patterns do rely, unfortunately, on concrete URIs rather than on resolvable URIs, by which I mean the painting slash URI has to be a real URI that can do things, and you get to it by knocking off 877 from the above URI. So if it was id.getty.edu/stuff/877, then id.getty.edu/stuff would be where any LDP implementation would try to interact to get the list of stuff. So if it was like a DOI type of thing, and id.getty.edu redirected to museum/art/painting/877, then probably the implementation would try to follow it and then find the container. But yeah, I'm not certain what the state of implementations is with that sort of.
I guess I'm wondering whether 877 itself could instead be replaced by a URI.
Oh, I see. Sorry. There are a few gotchas with that. So from previous experience with web archiving, putting URIs into URIs ends up with some very strange things happening at times.
Yeah.
Particularly around square brackets and other special characters. So it's not used pretty much anywhere, but square brackets is a possible characters in the host for IPv6 URIs. So then if you need to deal with that and you put square brackets somewhere else, everything gets really, really crazy. So yes, in simple cases, that can work. If it was as part of a query parameter, it's much easier because the rules for what characters can be in query parameters are less strict than what can be in the path. Yeah, I don't think it's probably a best practice though.
So I think, I mean, I'm trying to think of like in our tentative plan for this, if we have UUIDs representing each object, then clearly you could have a UUID instead of 877, and that would work. And even if we had a different representation, if we had a redirect service in place for the canonical URI that went to the linked art service, I don't think that would be a problem. And then the container portion of it wouldn't be affected by that. But the ID in that case would be the UUID, not the URI. So there would have to be some give and take there.
Yep.
Yeah. You'd have to essentially have a portion of your URI that wasn't, that was flexible to change, or like that alone is not enough to identify the object. So if you had like integers and you had a conflict, if you were relying on portions of the URI to differentiate that between, say, a constituent and an object,
yep,
you'd potentially get into trouble that way.
Yep, definitely. Right, well, it is a bit past the top of the hour. A couple of people had to run. So thank you to Emmanuel for taking the notes. Greatly appreciated. And thank you to everyone for joining. We will have another call in a couple of weeks' time. And between then and now and then, I will try to reach out to folks who agreed to work on the vocabulary part to see if we can get a plan together for what to discuss on that call about vocabulary issues rather than modeling issues. Okay, so thanks everyone again.
Thanks, Rob.
Talk again in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye now.